Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Chapter 13 is a chapter where Jesus washes the feet, his betrayal, and Peter's denial. It's all three in one chapter. Seems like a lot, but it goes pretty quickly. And there's some significant things. I didn't write, I just gave you the verses in the Bible, and we're just going to go kind of a little line by line here. And then at the end of the package, I just want you to look at it real quick and think about it, just keep it in the back of your mind. It's the picture of the Last Supper. Some will see that I highlighted something. I'm going to bring that up later.
That lady?
Okay. Chapter 13, it starts off, it was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And the evening meal was in progress, and the devil already prompted Judas and the son of Simon to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he had got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel then that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon and Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part of me." Then the Lord Simon Peter replied, "Not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have bathed need only to wash their feet. Their body who is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you," for he knew who was going to betray him. That was why he said not everyone was clean. That's the washing of the feet. And when you finish washing your feet, when he finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Did you understand what I have done for you?" He asked him. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is who I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I've done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do." And next one is Jesus predicts this. "I am not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen. But this is to fulfill the passage of Scripture. He who shares my bread has turned against me. I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am. Very truly, I tell you, whoever accepts anyone I send expect me. Whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me." After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you are going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another, at the loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to the disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give the piece of bread, and I will have dipped into the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered him. So Jesus told him, What are you about to do? Do quickly." But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival, or give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. Jesus predicts Peter's denial. When he has gone, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son and himself, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, just as I told the Jews. So I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I will give you: love one another as I loved you. So you must love one another. By this everyone knows that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Simon Peter asked, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where am I going? You cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." That's chapter 13. And what I got on chapter 13, going back to the washing of the feet, when Jesus does the unthinkable. He washes the feet of his disciples. And of course his disciples beginning to reject the act, And Jesus says, "What do I do? What I do, you do not realize now, but you shall understand hereafter." What did this mean to the disciples? What was the principal meaning of what he just said? You're going to realize this after. Some believed, and I believe, that he was teaching the disciples to be humble. Humble yourself. Because, just humble yourself, because to believe in him that he's washing my feet. I'm not greater than him, and he's not greater than me. To humble yourself in that way, that no one around you is greater than one other person. That's what I think he was teaching them about on the washing of the feet. And then, as you know later, he gives out a new commandment: to love one another as I loved you. Well, it's the same with the washing of the feet. I will wash your feet. To love each other to where you can do for each other, not just do for yourself. That's what I see on the washing of the feet. And then the one that betrays him was Judas. And John, in his book, he goes into great detail about how Jesus knows who it was by dipping the bread into what he did and then giving it to the person that it was. The disciples didn't know that Judas was the one that was going to betray him. So, but in his eyes, he and a few, but he didn't tell that to the whole table. He told it just to the few that were around him. And that was his gesture. And in John, in the book of John, that was his. He was in the book of John. He gives more, description of what actually happened at the meal than the other two, the synoptic ones. And then the farewell speech where Jesus gives his divine love to the disciples, his glorification, his departure, his divine love. The disciples who shared the whole world is part of God's plan. God loves and mediates the new way of his incarnation, of Jesus' incarnation. Okay. And going back to what I was showing you on the picture of the last picture. Well, another important thing that John did in this chapter, as he does in all the chapters, he puts down the time, kind of the dates of when this takes place. It says now before the festival of the Passover. In John's book, he makes sure it was after the Passover meal. And this was another thing that is kind of controversial because Passover meals only belong to the Jews at that time. But he says now it was a festival of the Passover. Okay. And in this verses of what I just read, and then other Bibles that I've read, it goes into a little, it's the same thing, but it just, the words are different about on the table, where everybody's sitting at the table, the Last Supper, and when he's having this discussion about who's going to betray him, it goes back to the one that Jesus loved. And this is where I get my conspiracy theory and try to solve what everyone is saying. Where John always says in his book, to whom the one Jesus loved. And in my reading of everything and reading the other stuff that I found online, books I saw in the library, if you look, the first person sitting next to him, and if I looked at several, I was going to print out 4 different artists who did the Last Supper. And each one of them, the person sitting to my right, to Jesus' right, and on my right here, looks like a woman. And in all the scriptures, in this chapter, in this book of John, he always says to whom Jesus loved. In all the paintings that I've seen, even the paintings that I saw in my house when I got home yesterday, because I went to the library yesterday. I went to the home, and we have this wooden Last Supper by our table. And even on that one, it's a machismo, manly paint thing made out of wood, but the person to his right has long hair. And it looks like a woman. So maybe John in this book was saying to whom he loved was actually Mary. And that's just my synopsis of chapter 13. But also, just this that teaches, this chapter teaches us to be humble and to be humble towards one another, because he gave us a new commandment, to love one another as I love you.
Chapter 13 is fascinating because we have different stories that are common with the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Like the betrayal of Judas. Okay, we've heard that before in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Peter's denial, heard that before. But what's fascinating is we have this new story that's introduced here into the Last Supper. It's a story that only John has of the washing of the feet. And that's the gospel that we have every Holy Thursday. When we celebrate the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper on Holy Thursday, what's the gospel that we have? Jesus leaving that last will and testament, if you will, saying, as I've done to you, it's your turn to do to others. Robert Greenleaf came up with the term servant leadership. Have you heard that before? Back in the 1970s, he coined the term servant leadership. And the example that he would look to was a person like Jesus who led others through serving them. So we see that in this 13th chapter. The devil enters here a few times. Did you notice that? In verse 2, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas. Yikes. We see not only this good God, but also this evil being, the devil, John calls him, who's at work in all of this. Because as soon as, in verse 27, as soon as Judas takes the bread, what happens? Satan entered him, according to the story that John told. That was his way of making sense of what it was that was happening. That Satan entered Judas and caused him to do what he was doing.
And it was night, in the dark, not in the light.
How fascinating. The light-dark symbolism, if we were to trace that and highlight in our Bibles what takes place during the light and what takes place during the dark, this is one of those stories that's taking place during the dark. Is the darkness going to prevail? Because what's fascinating is this is the Last Supper now. It's dark outside, and it's going to be this dark story now until Christ dies. What happened was when Christ dies, darkness fills the earth. But does the darkness triumph? Not ultimately.
No, but in this particular verse, 30, and it was night. I mean, that was when I think we had read in the prior book where the night is where you have the temptation, much more prominent.
And especially when it says when Judas left and it was at night. So the night had taken over him as being
The darkness.
evil, the darkness side.
Darkness, evil, night. We see how all of these themes converge in people like Judas and in figures like Satan.
But Judas always had darkness in him because when he a thief, he handled the purse and he was always.
So
But that's probably why he was chosen, because he knew he was going to be the one to betray him.
So this is my question for you. Just because Becky said that Deacon Roy was at a pub drinking, was Deacon Roy at a pub drinking? Follow me? Just because the evangelist said that Judas was such a terrible guy, was Judas such a terrible guy? Because if we go back to that, the types of messiahs that we were thinking about, if we were thinking that Jesus was going to be a Davidic king, then we welcomed him into town shouting, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest," because we thought that he was going to free us. Judas, think of this for a moment, was just trying to help his friend Jesus out. Because if he put him in a situation where, for instance, he was arrested, then suddenly Jesus would show his power and the story would turn out in the way that we wanted it to. You follow me? Was Judas really doing something that was evil, or was he doing something that he believed in his heart of hearts was really going to help his friend? Jesus, I'm doing you a favor here. I'm going to go get the chief priests. I mean, it's a different way of looking at it. We as human beings, before you question the intentions of any person, just think for a moment. People don't do things because those things are evil. They do those things because they perceive them to somehow be good. Yeah. So whether the good in this case was, as they suggest, that Judas was going to be making money from turning Jesus over, or whatever it is, the evangelist is trying to explain, why would Judas do this? Okay, John's explanation, Satan entered into Judas, and so he could use the excuse, the devil made me do it. Ooh. Well, if the devil makes you do something, then are you free? The devil made me do it? What happened to your freedom? Suddenly you're blaming the devil. It's not on you. You have no responsibility. You're blaming the devil. I want to draw our attention to verses 34 and 35 too, because we often hear these words at weddings. What's fascinating is in the midst of this darkness, what we see now beginning with chapter 13 is Jesus is going to start giving us what I refer to as his last will. These are his last words. And so John is not like all of the other evangelists. They just have the Last Supper and they move on. With John, we're going to spend a few chapters here in the Last Supper with Jesus telling us, preparing us for his death and giving us his last teachings on this earth. So that, for instance, his famous words, I am the vine, you are the branches. We're going to hear those in the Gospel of John during the Last Supper. So it's fascinating. What I often tell people is if you have the time on a Holy Thursday night, after we finish our Mass of the Lord's Supper, read the Lord's Supper from John, because it's a few chapters long and it's great meditation material. This is Jesus' last supper and what it is that he taught his disciples, told his disciples at that Last Supper.
You said it, this is said a lot at weddings? Interesting.
Interesting. Let's read verses 34 and 35. A new command I give you, love one another. So when the young couple is standing there ready to give themselves to one another for the rest of their lives, the deacon or the priest is often saying, telling the story of Jesus saying, I give you a new commandment. To do what? Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Or other translations say, as love one another as I have loved you. Oh, think of the preaching that you could do on that verse. The same way that Christ loves you, the same way that Christ loves your spouse, that's the same love that you're called to have toward him or her.
Kind of rubs me the wrong way.
Why does it rub you the wrong way?
Is it not used, or I feel like this is really important. And when you were reading it, it just struck me as like, this is his Last Supper, right? This is the time we should be listening to and hang on every word he says. And it's like, we haven't. I mean, I don't know. I feel like I should have heard this before, and I probably have. But this is such a big deal to me. And it made me think about the flock that we were just talking about as well. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Because by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. So if you are associated with me, that kind of rubs me the wrong way that it's just saved for marriage, to fit that in.
It also, as you're saying, is like, that's marriage. What also kind of struck me and kind of it hit me with the stone was like, Jesus just proved in this chapter that just because I'm your teacher, just because I'm your Lord, doesn't mean I can't wash your feet. To humble yourself, And it's just a title. And people think they're better than someone just because they have a title. And we don't follow what you're saying. This is his last words in testimony. And none of us, most of us in this world don't follow. And that's what hit me yesterday and the day before when I'm like putting all this together. And then when you just said about the marriage thing, I just felt like you too. I was like, oh,
well, not that marriage isn't important, but this could be extended so many other places. As Christians, as Catholics or Protestants or wherever, however, and how we engage with the people around us, different people from us. This should be it.
Yeah, it's just makes me, because just last night as I'm going to bed, I don't know, I was just flipping this channel and Joel Osteen was on. And he talked about the same thing, about love one each other and humble. Don't be afraid to walk up to someone and do something for them. Because eventually he may not do it, he may not give you in return, but maybe he will pass it forward to someone else to be humble. And then today, as I'm reading it, I'm just like, we don't use this at all.
So the whole humbling theme that we see here, Jesus is humbling himself, and what happens? He's lifted up. St. Bonaventure had this notion when he read stories like this of how it was that there's this circular movement in all of this. And Deacon Angelita started out this study of the Gospel of John with chapter 1 saying what? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and then what happened? The Word became flesh. It humbled himself. Paul's letter to the Philippians, what happened? Jesus was with God, but Jesus did not gain equality with God. Instead, he humbled himself and became among us. What happened in the end? He was exalted, lifted up. Here we have a story of Jesus humbling himself. He ultimately humbled himself in death. What would happen in the end, though? He'd be lifted up. Finally, this chapter ends with a prediction of 3 denials by Peter. Peter is going to deny Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. John is setting us up because John is the only one who's going to talk about how it was that Peter was restored, of how it is that, yes, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, but he's also going to profess his love 3 times in the end, with that chapter that a later editor added on to the Gospel of John, chapter 21. One last chapter.
Before we go on,
Please.
I wanted to mention an experience that I think is somewhat relevant, it is to me, and it's something that Sierra was saying about how this is it. And what Vincent was saying about the humbling experience and loving one another. When I went to India, there were periods of time, several periods of time, experiences that I had that honestly made me embarrassed that as Christian people, we do not have the level of sharing the love that people in the Hindu religion, where they, even the poorest of the poor, will show a love to someone, even a stranger, even though they have nothing, but they provide everything in their mannerism, in their communication, in their actions, and it's very humbling, because when you receive that kind of love, it's not, okay, I give you this much and then you give me this much. And so now we know, because we're in this church, that we love each other. It's so much more than that. And yet, even within our church, if you will, we may have a reservation in sharing that love, because we don't want to be, seen as breaking some boundary or barrier, and so therefore not sharing that love that person could use or may want or may need. So in that regard, I want to bring back that other flock and how love may be a definition of different flocks.
There you go. If only it were to define
What's
us,
that song,
define us
Father?
as well.
They'll know we were Christians.
Our love.